What happens when a father and son who haven't truly seen eye to eye in years suddenly find themselves standing face to face again? After months of silence, distance, and emotional separation, Matt Roloff and Zach Roloff have finally reunited. For little people, big world fans, this isn't just a simple meeting. It's something much deeper. It's a moment filled with emotion, a moment filled with uncertainty, and perhaps a moment that could change everything. Because for years, viewers watched their once close relationship slowly begin to fracture. Disagreements over Roloff Farms, differences in expectations, and emotional wounds that never fully healed. What was once a strong father and son bond gradually became distant, quiet, and painfully uncertain. Many fans began to wonder if reconciliation was even possible, if the distance had simply grown too great. And now, after everything that's happened, they've finally come face to face again. But the real question remains: was this reunion the beginning of healing? Or was it simply a brief moment between two people still searching for a way back to each other? If you want, I can also write the full 30-minute or 60-minute YouTube script in the same emotional storytelling style to match your channel's tone. For more than 2 decades, Little People, Big World has given viewers a deeply personal look into the lives of the Roloff family. Fans watched Matt Roloff turn a simple piece of land into something extraordinary. Roloff Farms became more than just a business. It became a symbol of hard work, perseverance, and family legacy. For Zach Roloff, that farm was never just property. It was home. It was the place where he grew up, where he learned life lessons, and where some of his most important memories were made. It represented comfort, belonging, and the promise of continuity. For many years, it seemed almost certain that the farm would remain a central part of Zach's future. But as time passed, things began to change. What once felt secure slowly became uncertain. Expectations no longer aligned the way they once had. Dreams that once felt shared began to move in different directions. And with those changes came something much harder to ignore: distance. Not just physical distance, but emotional distance. The conversations that once came easily became less frequent. The moments they shared became fewer. Public appearances together grew rare. And fans, who had watched their bond grow over many years, began to notice that something wasn't the same anymore. What had once been one of the strongest and most visible father-son relationships in the family now seemed fragile, uncertain, and possibly broken. For a long time, it appeared as though this distance might never fully heal. But now, something unexpected has happened. Matt and Zach have reunited. A moment no one saw coming. And it has left fans everywhere asking the same question. What does this reunion really mean for their relationship? And could this be the beginning of something new? To understand why this reunion matters so much, you first have to understand what caused the distance in the first place. Roloff Farms was never just a piece of property. It represented years of hard work, sacrifice, and shared memories. It was the place where the family grew together, where traditions were created, and where each member built a connection not only to the land but to each other. For Matt, the farm symbolized a lifelong dream. He had spent decades building it, shaping it into something meaningful, and imagining a future where that legacy would continue through his children. Passing it down wasn't simply about ownership, it was about continuity. It was about keeping the family story alive. For Zach, that legacy held an equally powerful meaning. He had grown up on the farm. It was part of his identity. The idea of raising his own children in the same environment, surrounded by the same traditions, felt like a natural and deeply personal continuation of his life. It represented stability, belonging, and connection. But when conversations about the farm's future began, things didn't unfold the way either side had hoped. What started as discussions about ownership gradually became more complicated. Expectations existed on both sides, but those expectations didn't fully align. Each person had their own perspective, their own vision of what the future should look like. And when those visions didn't match, disappointment began to grow. This wasn't simply a business negotiation. It became something far more emotional. It was about trust. It was about feeling heard. It was about whether the shared history they valued so deeply would continue in the way they had imagined. For Zach, the outcome may have felt like the closing of a door he had long hoped would remain open. For Matt, it may have been a difficult decision shaped by his own understanding of what was best for the future of the farm. But regardless of intention, the result was the same: distance. The easy conversations became less frequent. The natural closeness they once shared began to fade. Moments that had once brought them together became reminders of what had changed. What should have been a moment of transition, a passing of legacy from one generation to the next, instead became a moment that quietly reshaped their relationship. And from that point forward, their connection was no longer defined by the same sense of certainty it once had. It didn't mean the history disappeared. It didn't erase the years of shared experiences. But it marked the beginning of a new chapter, one defined not by what had always been, but by the challenge of navigating what came next. After the disagreement, both Matt and Zach turned their attention toward building their lives independently. What was once a shared daily connection gradually became two separate paths, each focused on different priorities and responsibilities. Zach and Tori created a new chapter away from Roloff Farms. Their focus shifted toward their home, their children, and the quiet routines of family life. They dedicated their energy to providing stability, nurturing their kids, and creating traditions that reflected their own values and vision for the future. Their world became centered on parenthood, school mornings, family time, and building a sense of belonging in a place they could call entirely their own. For Zach, stepping away from the farm was more than just a physical move. It represented a transition into independence. He was no longer defined by the property he grew up on, but by the family he was raising and the life he was shaping alongside Tori. Together, they focused on creating an environment filled with consistency, support, and new memories. Meanwhile, Matt remained deeply connected to Roloff Farms. The property continued to represent decades of effort, sacrifice, and vision. He stayed focused on maintaining the land, managing its operations, and thinking about what its future might look like. The farm was not just a business, it was part of his identity, a symbol of everything he had built over the years. Matt's days were filled with responsibility. There were decisions to make, plans to consider, and the ongoing work required to preserve something that had been central to his life for so long. Even as time passed and circumstances changed, his commitment to the farm remained constant. Both Matt and Zach were moving forward. Both were building lives that reflected their individual priorities. Both were focused on their families and their futures. But despite this progress, one thing remained unchanged: the emotional distance between them. They were rarely seen together publicly. There were no shared appearances, no visible signs of the easy connection they once had. Fans noticed, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. Sometimes, silence speaks louder than words. The absence of interaction became its own kind of message. It reflected the complexity of their relationship, shaped by past disagreements and unresolved emotions. It showed that even when people continue moving forward in their own lives, the bonds of family can remain complicated. Time moved on. Life continued. Responsibilities grew. But the distance between father and son remained a quiet, unspoken reality, one that fans could see, even without a single word being said. Then came the moment no one expected. Matt and Zach were seen together again. It wasn't a public announcement. It wasn't a staged event. It was simply a shared moment. But that moment carried meaning. Because reunions like this don't happen without reason. For fans, it was emotional. It represented possibility. Possibility that healing could begin. Possibility that time had softened the pain. and possibility that their relationship wasn't beyond repair. For years, the distance between them had felt permanent. Silence had replaced conversations, and the bond that once seemed unbreakable had slowly faded into uncertainty. But seeing them together again reminded everyone of something important. Relationships, no matter how strained, are never completely defined by their hardest moments. Sometimes, all it takes is one shared space, one quiet interaction, one decision to show up. Because presence carries its own message. A message that words don't always need to explain. For Matt, this moment may have represented reflection. A chance to reconnect not just with his son, but with the memories they once shared. For Zach, it may have represented something equally meaningful. A reminder that the past, while painful, doesn't have to control the future. Neither of them needed to explain anything publicly. They didn't need to make promises. They didn't need to define what this moment meant. Because sometimes, healing doesn't begin with clarity. It begins with willingness. Fans noticed the difference immediately. Not because of anything dramatic, but because of how simple it was. There was no pressure, no expectations, just presence. And presence can be powerful. It creates space for understanding. It allows emotions to settle. It opens the door to conversations that once felt impossible. This reunion didn't erase the past. It didn't undo the pain. But it did something just as important. It proved that distance isn't always permanent. Time has a way of changing perspective. It softens anger. It reshapes emotions. And sometimes, it makes reconnection possible. For fans who had watched their relationship fall apart, this moment meant everything. Because it represented hope. Hope that healing wasn't out of reach. Hope that family bonds could still be restored. Hope that this wasn't the end of their story. Even a single moment of connection can change everything. Because sometimes, healing begins quietly. Not with words, but with presence. Rebuilding a relationship takes time. It rarely happens in a single conversation. It doesn't come from one shared moment alone. And it certainly doesn't erase years of emotional distance overnight. Healing is slow, sometimes uncomfortable, sometimes uncertain. But every restored relationship begins somewhere. And for Matt and Zach, this reunion may represent that beginning. Because when two people who have experienced disappointment and misunderstanding find themselves standing in the same space again, it means something has shifted. Maybe not everything, but something. For years, the distance between them seemed permanent. Their lives had moved in different directions. Zach had built his own home, his own routines, his own version of family life, separate from Roloff Farms. He wasn't just physically distant. He was emotionally distant too. He had created boundaries, not out of anger alone, but out of necessity. Because sometimes, stepping away is the only way to protect your peace. Meanwhile, Matt remained connected to the farm. To him, the property was more than land. It was his life's work, a symbol of everything he had built. But even surrounded by that legacy, there was something missing. Presence, connection, family. Because achievements and accomplishments don't replace relationships. And time has a way of changing perspective. What once felt urgent becomes less important. What once felt like conflict becomes something you wish had been handled differently. Because as years pass, people begin to see things through a different lens. Not through pride, but through reflection. For Matt, seeing Zach again may have stirred emotions that had been buried beneath years of silence. Memories of raising him, working beside him, watching him grow from a child into a father himself. Moments that no disagreement could erase. Because no matter how complicated things become, a father never stops being a father. And a son never stops being a son. For Zach, the reunion may have carried its own emotional weight. Because returning, even briefly, to someone you've been distant from requires courage. It requires vulnerability. It requires letting down walls that were built for protection. Walls built from disappointment, from unmet expectations, from words that were said and words that were never said. But being present again, even for a moment, suggests openness. Not necessarily forgiveness. Not necessarily resolution. But openness. Openness to the possibility that the future doesn't have to look exactly like the past. Because people grow. They change. They mature. And sometimes, distance allows both sides to understand things they couldn't see before. It allows emotions to settle. It allows perspective to form. And it allows space for healing. This reunion doesn't guarantee that everything is fixed. It doesn't mean all disagreements have disappeared. It doesn't mean the pain of the past has been erased. But it does mean one important thing. The door is no longer completely closed. And sometimes, that's the most important step. Because reconciliation doesn't begin with solutions. It begins with presence. With being willing to show up. With being willing to exist in the same space again. Even when it's uncomfortable. Even when it's uncertain. For fans, this moment carries emotional significance too. Because they've witnessed the journey. They've seen the closeness. They've seen the distance. And now, they're seeing something that once felt impossible. A moment of reconnection. Not dramatic. Not announced. But meaningful. Because real healing rarely happens in front of cameras. It happens quietly. In small moments. In brief conversations. In gestures that may seem simple, but carry deep emotional weight. And perhaps that's what makes this reunion so powerful. It wasn't forced. It wasn't staged. It happened naturally. Which makes it real. Which makes it hopeful. Because when two people choose to reconnect, even in the smallest way, it shows willingness. And willingness is where everything begins. The future between Matt and Zach remains unwritten. No one knows exactly what will happen next. Whether this reunion will lead to more conversations, more visits, more shared moments, or whether it will remain a single step in a longer journey. But what matters most is that the step happened at all. Because healing doesn't require perfection. It requires effort. It requires time. And most importantly, it requires heart. This moment may not represent the end of their story, but it may represent something just as meaningful. A new chapter. One defined not by conflict, but by possibility. Little People, Big World has never been just another reality show. From the very beginning, it invited viewers into something deeply personal. It wasn't scripted drama. It was real life unfolding in real time. Viewers didn't just watch the Roloffs. They grew with them. They witnessed milestones. They witnessed challenges. And they witnessed the complicated emotional reality of family. For many fans, Zach wasn't just a cast member. He was someone they watched grow from a quiet, thoughtful child into a husband and father. They saw his insecurities. They saw his dreams. And they saw how much Roloff Farms meant to him, not just as land, but as a symbol of belonging, a symbol of identity, a symbol of family continuity. And Matt wasn't just the father figure on the show. He was the visionary, the builder, the one who transformed ordinary land into something extraordinary. Fans watched him overcome physical challenges, financial struggles, and countless obstacles to create a place that would become the heart of the Roloff family story. His determination inspired viewers, his flaws made him human, and his relationship with his children made him relatable. That's why the distance between Matt and Zach felt so heavy. It wasn't just their pain. It was something fans could feel too, because viewers had spent years watching their bond form. They had seen the laughter, the teamwork, the shared pride. Seeing that connection weaken created a sense of loss, not just for them, but for everyone who had followed their journey. Over time, the silence between them seemed to represent something bigger. It reflected the reality that even the strongest families face moments of separation, moments of misunderstanding, moments where love exists, but communication fails. And that reality resonated deeply with viewers because many had experienced similar situations in their own lives. Which is why this reunion carries so much emotional weight. It represents hope. Not necessarily that everything is suddenly perfect, not necessarily that every disagreement has disappeared, but hope that the door is no longer closed, hope that healing can begin, even if slowly, hope that time, reflection, and maturity can create space for understanding. For longtime fans, seeing Matt and Zach together again brings a sense of emotional relief. It reminds them of earlier years when the farm was filled with shared projects, shared laughter, and shared purpose. It reminds them of the foundation that existed long before the disagreements ever began. It also reminds viewers of something universal. Family relationships are rarely simple. They evolve. They face pressure. They go through seasons of closeness and seasons of distance. But moments like this prove that distance doesn't always mean permanence. Sometimes it simply means time is needed. Fans also see this moment as significant not just for Matt and Zach, but for the next generation. Because Jackson, Lila, and Josiah are growing up now, they are forming their own memories, their own understanding of family, and the possibility of renewed connection means they may have the opportunity to experience more shared moments together, more holidays, more visits, more memories that strengthen family bonds across generations. For viewers who have followed the Roloffs for years, this reunion feels like a full-circle moment, a reminder of where the story began and where it might still go. It doesn't erase the past, but it opens the possibility for a different future. And perhaps most importantly, it reinforces one of the core themes that Little People, Big World has always represented. Resilience. Not just physical resilience, not just financial resilience, but emotional resilience. The ability to face pain, to face disappointment, and eventually to face each other again. Because sometimes, healing doesn't happen all at once. Sometimes, it begins with a single moment. A single conversation. A single reunion. And for Matt and Zach Roloff, that moment may be the beginning of something fans have been hoping for all along. Right now, there are still many unanswered questions about what comes next for Matt Roloff and his son Zach. This reunion doesn't erase the past. It doesn't instantly resolve years of disappointment, hurt, and distance. But it does represent something meaningful. Because after everything they've been through, they chose to be in the same place again. They chose to share a moment. And sometimes, that's how healing begins. Not through dramatic announcements. Not through perfectly scripted conversations. But through quiet, human moments. Moments where pride softens. Moments where walls lower. Moments where the door, even just slightly, opens again. For Matt and Zach, this reunion may be the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter built not on expectations, but on understanding. Not on the past, but on what's still possible. And for fans who have followed their journey for so many years, this moment carries deep emotional weight. Because it reminds us of something universal. Family relationships can be complicated. They can face challenges. They can face distance. But they can also find their way back. Even if the path forward is slow. Even if it's uncertain. Even if it starts with something as simple as standing together again. The future of their relationship remains unwritten. But one thing is clear. This moment mattered. Not just to them, but to everyone who has watched their story unfold. And maybe, just maybe, this is where reconciliation truly begins. If you've been following the Roloff family's journey, share your thoughts in the comments below.